The abdominal region itself is covered by a serous membrane which lines the cavity, the peritoneal cavity. And this peritoneum covers the organs. So it's called the peritoneum. And the cavity is called the peritoneal cavity. So just like any other cavity protecting the organs, like the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity, the peritoneal cavity is also a very thin lining of serous membrane which protects the abdominal region. So the stomach is actually a two-layer fold of peritoneum. So we can divide it into something called as omentum or omentum. So there's a lesser omentum and a greater omentum. Now the lesser omentum attaches the stomach to the liver. So it's an extension or fold of the peritoneum that connects the stomach to the liver. And the greater omentum, so you can see the liver over here, the stomach over here, and this is the lesser omentum. Now the other portion, which is the greater omentum, it covers the small intestine like an apron. So the greater omentum basically lies behind your belly, in between the abdominal muscles and the intestine. So it's like an apron between the abdominal muscles and the intestine. So the omentum is basically just a continuation or a part of the peritoneum. And the other serous membrane that lines the small intestine is the mesentery. So the mesentery of the small intestine is this fan-like structure that holds the intestine together. Now the omentum is surgically important if, say, the tumors metastatize into the peritoneal cavity. Now the omentum can be removed if needed. So the omentum, if removed, cannot grow back. Then you have the mesocolon. So the mesocolon anchors the colon to the body wall. And then you have the mesentery, which is the fan-like foldings in the intestine. Now the mesentery is actually important because you can see that it contains a whole bunch of blood vessels, which include arteries and veins that carry blood to this region and take away deoxygenated blood away from this region. So the first major region of the abdomen is the stomach. So this over here you see is the esophagus, and right under the esophagus, this is the diaphragm, the muscle that separates the abdominal region from the thoracic region. The stomach receives food from the esophagus, and when the food reaches the end of the esophagus, it enters the stomach. So this bulge around the stomach is called the fundus, and after the fundus, it leads to a narrowing of the stomach. So it's a J-shaped structure, and the end of the stomach has a sphincter muscle. The beginning of the stomach also has a sphincter muscle that control the intake of food into the stomach and out of the stomach. Now both these muscles are a band of the sphincter itself, are a band of smooth muscles at junctions of the stomach. Now the very important muscle in the bottom is called the pyloric sphincter. This smooth muscle is a junction between the stomach and the duodenum. The duodenum is the first region of the small intestine. And in the stomach, when the food enters, the stomach secretes acids and enzymes to digest food. So it plays an important role in digestion at a very, very low pH. So the pH of the stomach is about 2 to 2.5, which is really, really low. Now, the partially digested food from the stomach gets digested well, and especially meat. It has a really high acid content. So the sphincter muscle must close it off from the small intestine, just so the small intestine doesn't get damaged in the presence of the acid. So the stomach is protected from the acids by a really thick layer of mucus. And any breach in the mucus layer can cause ulceration. So sometimes, when you have ulcers, you can be infected. That could be due to infection of Helicobacter pylori. And Helicobacter pylori, the bacteria that basically screws itself into the walls of the stomach, which causes damage to the mucus layer, thereby leading to ulceration. Now, the stomach itself can stretch quite a bit. So the smallest stomach is probably a 50 ml capacity, but it can stretch to hold about 1 gallon, which is almost 4.4 liters. And it can extend down into the pelvic cavity when it's really, really full. So the main functions of the stomach include food storage, and it regulates the release of enzyme to digest food. So the liquefied form of food in presence of stomach acids and enzymes is known as chyme. Let me write this down. So the liquefied food in the stomach is known as chyme. So this is where chemical digestion of proteins begin in the stomach at really, really low acid. Now, the other important muscle of the stomach is the lower esophageal sphincter. Now, the lower esophageal sphincter, as we talked about, is just another name for the cardiac sphincter for its proximity to the heart. But it can also be called the lower esophageal sphincter. And this lower esophageal sphincter separates the upper region of the stomach from the esophagus. So it basically prevents acid reflux into the esophagus that causes heartburn. Now, the stomach contains two important things. The first one is pepsin, and the second is hydrochloric acid, or HCl. Now, hydrochloric acid and pepsin are two very important chemicals to break down proteins. Okay, so both of these together digest the food and make it into a paste we just called chyme. So the chyme is a whitish paste, which is a mixture of all the food and hydrochloric acid and pepsin. So the gastric glands secrete gastric juices, and it is really, really acidic. So one of the main important functions of the gastric juices is to kill any bacteria that we ingest through our food. And another role of the acid, which is specifically HCl, is to activate certain enzymes. So pepsinogen, which is an inactive form, becomes pepsin, and pepsin is important for denaturing and breaking down protein. So apart from pepsin, the gastric juices also activate lipases that are enzymes required for digestion of or breaking down of fat, and then renin, which we talked about in the renin-angiotensin system that controls a lot of hormonal regulation. And some secrete intrinsic factor, that we'll look at the cell that secrete intrinsic factor, which is a molecule, specifically a glycoprotein, which is important for absorption of vitamin B12 in the small intestine. And the gastric juices also contain hormone known as gastrin, and gastrin is important for stimulation of other specialized cells in the gastric pit. Now, the gastric pit are indentations in the stomach. So the walls of the stomach are primarily made of mucus cells, but they also have some specialized cells that secrete all the gastric juices. So all the way at the end of the gastric pit, we see muscularis mucosa and the submucosa. So you can see a band of smooth muscles that help in expelling the gastric juices out of the pit into the stomach. So the first type of specialized cell in the gastric pit is the G cell. G cells secrete gastrin that are responsible for activation of so many other cells to secrete their gastric juices. So the second cell over here is the chief cell. Chief cells secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase. So pepsinogen gets converted to pepsin, and pepsinogen breaks down proteins, whereas lipase helps in lipid metabolism. Now, next type of cell, which is very, very important in activating these enzymes, is the hydrochloric acid secreting parietal cells. Now, hydrochloric acid is important for activation of pepsin and lipase and renin, and it's also important for killing the bacteria that we ingest along with food. The other important thing that the parietal cell secretes is the intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor is a glycoprotein which is important for B12 absorption in the small intestine. Now, the other cell is the mucus cell. It's no surprise that the stomach has a lot of mucus secreting cells. So all of these cells you see are mucus secreting cells. You have the surface mucus cells and the mucus neck cells. Both of them secrete mucus. The mucus that is secreted in the stomach is acidic and runny, thin mucus, which is very different from the mucus that is secreted by the goblet cells in, say, the respiratory tract. But the function of these mucus cells is not completely understood. Now, the last type of cell, well, we've talked about all of these cells, but just keep in mind that all of these cells are epithelial cells that line the stomach. So the next part of the stomach is the small intestine. Now, the small intestine consists of the first part, which is the duodenum. The separation between the duodenum and the stomach is called the pyloric sphincter, and it contains a bile duct and a pancreatic duct. So the next part is the jejunum, which is about 8 feet tall, and the lowest most part is the ileum, which is about 12 feet long, and they are suspended from the mesentery, from the abdominal wall, with the help of the mesentery, which is a fan-like structure that holds this long small intestine together. So if we actually pull out the small intestine, they're about 30 feet long. So the mesentery with a lot of fat is a specialized layer that you call omentum. So we saw the greater and lesser omentum. Now, the chemical digestion of food, as we discussed, begins in the stomach. This bump that you're seeing, that we call the fundus, stores all the gases that is produced during digestion. And in the bottom, chyme is made in the presence of gastric juices, and the presence of chyme actually inhibits the secretion of excessive acid. So once chyme is formed, it sends a signal to the gastric pits in there to make sure too much acids are not secreted into the stomach. Now, the perforation of the stomach can cause ulcers. And the most important function by far of the stomach is to aid in absorption of vitamin B12. And it also, in infants, it helps in activation of renin, which is an enzyme and a hormone. And renin in infants help in breaking down milk. Now, the food stays in the stomach for about 2 to 4 hours before it enters the duodenum. And in the small intestine, it stays for about 24 to 72 hours for full digestion from start to finish. It takes 6 hours or longer for processing the fatty chyme, but the whole process can take anywhere between 24 to 72 hours. So the small intestine is the main area for absorption and breaking down of the remaining food, and it's mainly performed by enzymes of the pancreas. So once the chyme mixes or enters into the duodenum from the stomach, the bile juices that are secreted neutralize the acidic pH of the stomach acids as they enter into the small intestine. So the bile contains bile acids, which are critical for digestion and absorption of fats and fat-soluble vitamins in the small intestine. So many waste products are bilirubin, and bilirubin is eliminated from the body by secretion into the bile. So when blood breaks down, you get bilirubin and biliverdin, and it's eliminated in the feces. This is why feces looks of yellowish color, because of the presence of bilirubin and biliverdin. So the main function of the small intestine is to aid in digestion and absorption of fats. Okay. So what is the difference between bile and pancreatic juice? So just keep in mind that bile itself, its main function is to neutralize the acids from the stomach as they pass into the small intestine. And bile juice is secreted by the liver, whereas pancreatic juice is secreted by the pancreas. Bile juice only acts on fats, and we'll look at it when we look at gallbladder and liver in just a second. But the pancreatic juice secretes enzymes like amylase, trypsin, lipase, specifically lingual lipase. And the pancreatic juice helps in digestion of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, whereas bile juices only act on fat. So the main function of small intestine is to act as the primary site of absorption. So the surface area for absorption is increased by a pleated lining in the stomach, which has a whole bunch of villi and microvilli. And each villus is a network of a lacteal. A lacteal is a lymphatic vessel. So the capillaries and the lacteal in the villus carry away absorbed products of the protein and carbohydrate digestion, as well as ions and water. Um, Now, lacteals carry away absorbed products of fat digestion. So this is the main difference between lacteal and capillaries. Capillaries carry away absorbed products of protein and carbohydrates, and ions and water. But lacteal is important for carrying away products of fat digestion. So the next part of the stomach is the large intestine. The main function of the large intestine is to aid in reabsorbing water and compact the remaining indigestible food matter, then pass it out as waste. So that is the main function of the large intestine. The large intestine mainly consists of the cecum and the colon, and it starts in the right iliac region of the pelvis, just below the right waist, where it's joined at the end of the small intestine. So cecum is basically the beginning of the large intestine. So right next to the cecum, well, right under the cecum, you see the appendix. So the appendix is an inner organ which was known to be vestigial before, but now we have begun to understand that cecum is an important storage for microbes. So they aid in the microbial makeup of the intestine, and they help in metabolism and digestion. Now, the appendicitis is the inflammation of the appendix, and what happens is sometimes it can be clogged by fecal matter or bacteria and can be inflamed. And in that case, appendicitis occurs and it needs to be removed. So right above the appendix, there is the cecum, and then the sphincter between the large intestine and the ileum, which is the lowermost part of the small intestine, is called the ileocecal valve. So there's a ring of muscle that surrounds this opening, and it controls the inlet of food into the large intestine. The large intestine itself is about 1.5 meter long, about 4.95 feet, and the ascending section right above the cecum is called the ascending colon, and then the transverse section is called the transverse colon, and right from the transverse colon it goes down, that's called the descending colon, and the stern between the descending colon and the rectum is called the sigmoid colon. So the main differences between the large and small intestine is that the large intestine is much wider, and it mainly helps in reabsorption of water and elimination of feces. Now the intestine as a whole, both the large and small intestine, have a bunch of goblet cells, but the large intestine has more goblet cells than the small intestine. The large intestine is lined with simple columnar epithelium, and the small intestine has a lot of microvilli and villus for aiding absorption, but the large intestine, on the other hand, contains a lot of intestinal gland, a lot of goblet cells, and simple columnar epithelium. Okay, so this over here is the mesentery, that's the membrane, the fan-like membrane that holds the abdomen, the intestine in the abdominal region. So the abdominal wall is held together with the intestine. So the ascending well, you can see, sorry, the mesenteric arteries can be seen very clearly in the mesentery membrane over here. So the mesenteric artery basically brings arterial blood or highly oxygenated blood to all the cells in the colon. So the large intestine is about 5 feet in length approximately. Main function is to reabsorb water and compact the indigestible waste into feces. The opening between the ileum and the large intestine is called the ileocecal valve, and there's a huge change in diameter between the small and large intestine. The small intestine is really narrow and it contains a whole bunch of microvilli because small intestine's main function is to absorb nutrients. The large intestine's main job is to absorb remaining water and compact indigestible material into feces. So the large intestine is made up of cecum and the colon mainly, but the other parts are the rectum and the anus. So the rectum and anus are involved in eliminating feces. So the tissue type in the rectum is stratified squamous epithelium because wherever you see a lot of wear and tear and a lot of force, which we exert in the anus and rectum while eliminating feces, right? So these regions will have a lot of stratified squamous epithelium. And the anus itself is made of 2 important muscles, internal and external sphincter, that helps us control the discharge of feces. So the liver is another main organ in the digestive system, and it's an organ that sits on the right hand side of the body. So it's present right above the abdominal region, the intestine, and right below the diaphragm. So it partly sits on top of the stomach, the right kidney, and the intestine. So it is a dark red brown color, which is shaped this way. So it extends all the way from the right to slightly above the stomach on the left. Its main function is to maintain blood glucose in the short term, and it also helps in packaging lipoproteins for transporting, and also helps in fat metabolism. So it synthesizes a lot of important plasma proteins like albumin and clotting factors, which are very, very important. Now, another important function of the liver is to convert ammonia to urea. It is also an important area for storage of some vitamins, ions, and detoxifying drugs. So it's a very important organ for detoxification. Now, another important thing is that the liver makes bile to emulsify fat. So the bile duct is the one that you see over here, and that's the gallbladder. So when somebody has their gallbladder removed, they need to control their fat intake because gallbladder and the bile juices are important in fatty acid metabolism. Now, the vein that conveys blood to the liver from the spleen, stomach, pancreas, and intestine is known as the portal vein. Now, this vein is really, really important. Why? Because liver plays a very important role in breaking down blood. So the byproduct is called bilirubin. Bilirubin is a yellowish substance in your blood, and after blood breaks down, it travels through your liver, gallbladder, and digestive tract before it is excreted out of the body. So when somebody has really high bilirubin levels, it leads to a condition known as hyperbilirubinemia. So hyperbilirubinemia is really high amounts of bilirubin in the blood, which leads to yellowing of the skin and eyes, and we call that condition jaundice. Now, many babies are also born with newborn jaundice because at birth the liver isn't often able to process bilirubin very well. It's a temporary condition and it's usually resolved on its own within few weeks. Now, the other accessory organ are the gallbladder. It's the gallbladder and the pancreas. So the gallbladder sits right under the liver. So the main function of gallbladder is to store bile that is made by the liver, and it secretes bile into the duodenum via the bile duct. Now, this is where the duodenum and stomach inlet is controlled by the pyloric sphincter, and the main role of the bile juices is to help in fatty acid metabolism and to neutralize the stomach juices that are present in chyme, just so the small intestine doesn't get damaged. So the gallbladder is the main site of gallstones, and gallstones form in the gallbladder when the cholesterol or bilirubin levels in the blood is really high. There are other things like liver diseases or blood diseases like sickle cell anemia, or liver diseases like cirrhosis can cause gallstones in people. But your body needs bile, but if there's too much cholesterol in it, that makes gallstone highly likely in people. So gallstones also occur when the gallbladder cannot really empty properly. So the next accessory organ over here is the pancreas. So this over here is the pancreatic duct, and the structure is the pancreas. The pancreas is the structure that secretes digestive enzymes into the duodenum via the pancreatic duct. So both these juices together help in neutralizing the stomach acid. And the pancreas contain enzymes that break down carbohydrates, fats, and protein, whereas the main role of the bile juices is to help in fatty acid metabolism. So the pancreatic juice contains amylase, trypsin, and lipase. Amylase helps in breaking down starch, trypsin helps in breaking down protein, and lipase helps in fatty acid metabolism. Now, the pancreas also contain bicarbonate ions. Now, these are the ions. If you remember, we talked about bicarbonate ions in the blood that help in maintaining basicity. And this bicarbonate ions are important in neutralizing the acids in the chyme that is formed in the stomach. So these juices drain from the pancreas into the pancreatic duct, where they fuse with the common bile duct before entering the small intestine. So here you see all the three organs together. You see the liver, and liver sits right under the diaphragm, and there's the stomach. Right behind the stomach, you have the pancreas. The pancreatic duct is right over here. It combines with a common bile duct and then releases the juices into the small intestine. Now, there are several different types of disorders that can be caused due to problems with anything in the abdominal region. So this region is so large, and that's why it's divided into 9 different regions. So when you go to the doctor with, let's say, stomach ache or jaundice, they palpate different regions of the abdomen to get an understanding of where the problem might be. But that is not enough. So So we're just going to look at a few disorders that are associated with the stomach. The first one is anorexia. Anorexia is the eating disorder, which is a form of self-starvation. So they have an emotional disorder which is characterized by obsessive desire to lose weight, and people refuse to eat. Then I'm sure you heard of bulimia as well. So bulimia is also known as, when you call somebody bulimic, they're really talking about bulimia nervosa, which is a clinical condition, which is also an emotional disorder, wherein a person has an obsessive desire to lose weight. But in bulimia, they basically binge eat a huge amount of food, and then it is followed by self-induced vomiting, purging, or fasting. Now, some other conditions include, jaundice. Now, jaundice can be caused by several different reasons. So jaundice itself, or yellowing of the skin, is just a symptom and not a disease itself. Now, jaundice develops when the flow of bile normally excreted by the liver is either reduced or blocked. So bilirubin is retained in the bloodstream because the bile duct doesn't function properly in removing all the bilirubin from the bile juices, through the bile juices. Now, there are several different types of jaundice that are manifested either due to hepatitis. Hepatitis is a result of a viral infection, and jaundice can be caused, or it can be a result of hepatitis A, B, C, D, and E. So there's several different types of hepatitis. So hepatitis happens when the liver cells get inflamed by virus attack and release of toxins in the liver as well. So jaundice can be seen several years after hepatitis infection as well. So the infection of the liver can lead to cirrhosis or scarring of the liver, which leads to the liver not functioning properly. So, as we discussed below, liver is very important in fatty acid metabolism. So when fatty acids get stored in the liver cells or accumulated in the liver cells, the buildup can cause fatty liver. A lot of times fatty liver can have no symptoms at all, but the usual symptoms or initial symptoms might include fatigue, weight loss, and abdominal pain. And the treatment usually involves, diet control and exercise. So in a very small amount of patients, fatty liver can progress to liver cirrhosis, leading to liver failure. Then you have cholestatic jaundice. So cholestatic jaundice is specifically associated with the blockage of the liver or reduced elimination of bilirubin by the bile ducts. So it ends up retaining bilirubin in the bloodstream. This type often requires medication and surgical procedure to cure the disease. So with this, we've completed the main elements of digestive system. And I hope you watch this video before you come to class.